It was late December 1941, and the world was still reeling from the shock of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. For Winston Churchill, sitting in the comfort of Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, the news hit like a thunderclap. Though the Japanese had attacked the United States, Churchill immediately understood the monumental implications of the attack. The United States, the world's industrial colossus, had finally entered the war. At last, after 2 long and exhausting years of fighting alone against Nazi Germany, Britain would have a true partner in this fight. For Churchill, this was a game-changing moment. The United States was no longer just a distant observer, but a full-fledged combatant. He later wrote that after receiving the news, he slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. This brief moment of rest was a small reprieve from the overwhelming weight of responsibility that had pressed down on him since May 1940. For over 2 years, Britain had stood virtually alone against Hitler. The Blitz had ravaged London and other major cities, destroying much of the country's infrastructure and terrorizing its population. But in these dark moments, Churchill had led his nation through excruciating despair, holding the line through sheer will and determination. He had rallied the people with speeches, kept morale high, and done everything possible to keep Britain in the fight. Yet as much as he tried to maintain optimism, he knew that Britain's survival could not continue without a significant shift in the war's balance. What Britain needed was not just more supplies. They needed soldiers. In the years before, Churchill had desperately tried to convince President Franklin D. Roosevelt to join the war. He had sent countless letters, sometimes pleading, sometimes imploring, all the while appealing to Roosevelt's sense of duty and responsibility. These weren't just diplomatic gestures. They were personal, heartfelt messages from one leader to another, recognizing the urgency of the situation. Churchill's mother, Jennie Jerome, had been American, which created an unspoken bond between the two men. They shared a common heritage, a common language, and a common cause. But it was more than just family ties that bound them together. It was the dire realization that Britain was on the brink of collapse without U.S. intervention. The two men built a personal relationship that extended beyond mere diplomacy. Roosevelt, in turn, respected Churchill's tenacity and his unwavering resolve to fight for freedom. By December 8, 1941, the United States had formally declared war on Japan. Just days later, in a stunning miscalculation, Hitler declared war on the United States. Churchill, ever the tactician, wasted no time. He knew this was the turning point. He immediately made plans to travel to Washington to meet Roosevelt and discuss strategy. But more than strategy, Churchill's thoughts were consumed with one question: when would American troops arrive in Britain? It was not just about the diplomatic victory of having America in the war. It was about seeing real soldiers, American soldiers, fighting side by side with British troops. Churchill understood that this would be the true test of American commitment. The arrival of American troops on British soil would signify that the United States was fully invested in the outcome of the war, and that they were ready to fight for the survival of Britain and the free world. The first American soldiers set foot in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. They were part of the advanced elements of the U.S. Army's 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division. These young men, with their fresh uniforms and their wide-eyed enthusiasm, were not just a lifeline. They were the embodiment of the future of the Allied cause. For Churchill, this marked the beginning of what he had fought for. These were the first of many more to come. As these soldiers stepped onto British soil, the reality of American involvement in the war began to take shape. Yet, despite the excitement that these initial arrivals generated, doubts still lingered in Churchill's mind. The first wave of troops was small compared to what was needed. A handful of soldiers had arrived, but what Britain required was an army, a massive force that would match the scale of the war they were fighting. Churchill knew that the true test of America's commitment would come when American soldiers began to flood the streets of Britain, when their presence could be felt, not just in small, symbolic gestures, but as a real force that would change the course of the war. In that moment, Churchill knew that Britain's burden would no longer be carried alone. Churchill, always the strategist, was quick to understand that Britain's resolve and determination had held strong, but these qualities alone would not win the war. It would take more than just defiance. It would take industrial capacity, manpower, and coordination. Britain had held out against Nazi Germany for 2 years, but its resources were running thin. Its supplies, while crucial, were no longer enough. The U.S. had sent much-needed aid under the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, tanks, airplanes, ammunition, food, and other vital supplies. Churchill knew that without the presence of soldiers, Britain's efforts could only stretch so far. The emotional and psychological impact of seeing American troops march through Britain would be profound. It was not just about fighting the war, it was about lifting the spirit of a nation that had stood alone for so long. The arrival of American soldiers would signify that Britain's efforts were now part of a much larger, more powerful force. Churchill understood the implications of American involvement on a deeply personal level. As much as he had longed for American entry into the war, he knew that it would take months for the full scale of U.S. military involvement to manifest. The first arrivals were only the beginning. Churchill knew that the presence of these soldiers would need time to grow, and it would take months before their impact was truly felt. The seeds had been planted. As January 1942 drew to a close, Churchill's optimism began to swell. His dream of seeing American troops in action was no longer just a hopeful desire, it was beginning to take shape. The U.S. had joined the war, and now it was time for the world to witness the fruits of this momentous decision. For Churchill, this was not just a strategic development, it was a personal triumph. He had spent years pleading with Roosevelt, waiting for this moment, and now it was finally here. Churchill's thoughts were not just of military strategy, but of the profound significance of the moment. As he watched the first American soldiers arrive, the weight of the past 2 years seemed to lift slightly. For the first time in a long while, Churchill allowed himself to believe that victory was within reach. His words in private reflected his belief. "When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war." This simple statement, made in the heat of the moment, carried immense weight. Churchill was a man not given to simplistic optimism. His entire career had been defined by pragmatism, by an unwavering belief in the possibility of victory despite the odds. But in that instant, standing in the streets, watching American soldiers march toward him, he allowed himself to believe in the outcome. These men were not just young, fresh faces, they were a force that would change the trajectory of the war. Churchill, who had spent so long trying to rally his own people, could now see the weight of their commitment in real, tangible terms. This was no longer just an abstract dream of victory, it was a possibility, made real by the arrival of these American soldiers. It was also a moment of reflection for Churchill, as he remembered the speeches, the letters, the endless hours of persuasion and hope. Now, finally, it seemed that all his efforts had paid off. The U.S. was no longer just sending supplies. They were sending their finest, to fight and die alongside Britain in the struggle against Nazi tyranny. For Churchill, this was not just a matter of military strategy, it was a personal vindication of his leadership. He had stood firm, he had kept Britain in the fight, and now the Americans had come to share the burden. And with them, Churchill knew, victory was no longer a distant hope, it was an achievable goal. In the months that followed, as more American soldiers flooded into Britain, the true scale of the transformation became clear. By mid-1942, over 100,000 American troops would be stationed in Britain, and the American buildup would continue until, by the time of the D-Day landings in 1944, over 1.5 million U.S. soldiers would be stationed in Britain, ready to invade Europe and take the fight directly to Nazi Germany. But for Churchill, the moment that truly mattered was when he stood on the streets of London and watched those first American troops march by. That was the moment when he could finally say to himself, "We are going to win this war." The arrival of the first wave of American troops in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942, was not just a logistical achievement. It was a symbolic moment that marked the beginning of a transformative period in World War II. For Winston Churchill, the significance of these young men stepping onto British soil was far greater than the sum of their numbers. These were not merely soldiers in uniform. They represented the lifeblood of a partnership that would change the course of history. As the U.S. Army's 34th Infantry Division, also known as the Red Bull Division, disembarked onto the cold, wind-swept docks of Belfast, the British people witnessed something they had longed for but could not imagine, the tangible manifestation of America's commitment to the war effort. These were the first of many American soldiers who would eventually flood into Britain, transforming the landscape of the war and shifting the momentum in the Allies' favor. But as these men set foot in Belfast, their arrival was not without its challenges. They were not yet the battle-hardened veterans that would storm the beaches of Normandy in 2 years' time. They were young, many barely out of their teens, and most had never been outside of the United States before. They were full of idealism, excitement, and nervous energy, stepping into a world that had already been at war for over 2 years. Their destination was not a peaceful, prosperous Britain, but a country ravaged by bombings, rationing, and the crushing weight of an unrelenting conflict. The arrival of American forces, while celebrated by some, was met with mixed feelings by others. In Northern Ireland, the soldiers were greeted with open arms, but in Britain, the reaction was more complicated. The British were grateful for the help, but also wary of the cultural differences and the visible contrast in lifestyle. For many, the Americans were a stark reminder of just how long Britain had been standing alone. The Americans were young and confident, their uniforms pristine, their gear modern and sophisticated. They were unscarred by the war, and their appearance seemed almost out of place in a country that had been bombed into submission. As the American soldiers began to settle into their new bases across Britain, they brought with them not just their military expertise, but their American way of life. The contrast between British and American culture became a source of friction. British soldiers, worn thin from years of fighting, were paid far less than their American counterparts, who enjoyed better rations, better equipment, and a standard of living that seemed unimaginable to those who had been living under rationing for so long. The famous phrase, overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, quickly circulated among the British public, a reflection of the tension between the two forces. But even beneath the humor and resentment, there was an undeniable truth. The Americans had come to stay, and they brought with them not just material support, but a new sense of hope. Churchill, however, was focused on something far more important than the cultural clashes. He was witnessing the birth of an alliance that would change the face of the war. The arrival of the Americans was not just about military aid. It was about the strategic implications of having such a powerful ally. Britain had been holding its ground against Nazi Germany, but it could not sustain this effort alone. The American military, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, would be the key to turning the tide. Churchill knew that the true impact of the American arrival would not be felt immediately. It would take time for the American troops to fully integrate into the British war effort. But the seeds had been planted, and Churchill's vision of a joint Allied force was now becoming a reality. In early 1942, Churchill's thoughts were consumed with one question: how would the British military work alongside this new, powerful force? The Americans, with their fresh approach and vast resources, represented the future of the Allied effort. But the British had been fighting this war for 2 long years. They had learned hard lessons in North Africa, in the skies over Britain, and on the streets of London. Their experience would be invaluable to the Americans, who were still learning the ropes of warfare in a European theater. Churchill understood that the key to success would be collaboration. The Americans would bring their industrial might, while the British would provide their hard-earned knowledge of how to fight a war against a powerful and determined enemy. The arrival of American soldiers was the beginning of a process that would ultimately result in the Operation Bolero strategy. The buildup of American forces in Britain in preparation for the eventual invasion of Europe, the arrival of these troops also represented the physical embodiment of America's commitment to the war effort. The symbol of American soldiers marching through British cities, boarding transports to carry them to the front lines, was more powerful than any diplomatic communique or speech Churchill could give. It was proof that the United States had fully committed itself to the Allied cause, that the tide of the war had indeed shifted in favor of the Allies. Churchill's optimism, which had been tempered by years of fighting alone, began to swell. He had been waiting for this moment, this tangible sign that victory was no longer a distant dream, but a realistic goal. As more American soldiers arrived in Britain, their presence became a reminder that the war was no longer just Britain's struggle, was now a shared effort with the full weight of American industry, manpower, and military power behind it. But Churchill also knew that it would take time for the Americans to integrate into the British war machine. Their arrival was just the beginning. In the early days of 1942, as Churchill observed the growing presence of American troops in Britain, his thoughts turned to the practicalities of this new alliance. The Americans would bring with them vast quantities of equipment, tanks, planes, and artillery, but they would also bring something else: fresh manpower, which was exactly what Britain needed. The addition of American soldiers would provide the crucial numerical advantage that would allow the Allies to mount the massive campaigns necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. This was the moment Churchill had been waiting for, but he understood that there was still much to be done before the true strength of the American contribution could be realized. The American soldiers themselves were caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean on overcrowded transports, arrived in a foreign land that had been at war for years, and found themselves thrust into the heart of the conflict. Many of them were young, inexperienced, and full of questions. They had trained in camps across America, but nothing could prepare them for the harsh realities of warfare in Europe. Yet, despite their youth and inexperience, they brought with them an indomitable spirit that would prove invaluable in the battles to come. Their arrival in Britain was not just a logistical victory, it was a victory of morale. The British people, exhausted by years of bombings and losses, could now look forward with hope. The Americans had come to fight, and they would help Britain win the war. Churchill's reflections were not just about the immediate tactical advantages of the American presence, they were also about the long-term implications of this new partnership. The alliance between Britain and the United States would define the course of the war, and Churchill knew it. The shared determination, the combined forces, and the unity of purpose that would emerge from this partnership would prove to be the key to defeating Hitler's regime. But Churchill also understood that this was just the beginning. The arrival of American soldiers in Britain was not the end, it was the start of a process that would culminate in the Allied victory. In the months that followed, the American military presence in Britain would continue to grow, and with it, the Allied war effort would become stronger, more coordinated, and more capable of taking on the Nazis. But for Churchill, the arrival of those first American soldiers in January 1942 was a turning point, marked the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's domination over Europe. It was not just a moment of relief for Britain, it was a moment of hope. And for the first time since 1940, Churchill could see victory on the horizon. This section explores the arrival of the American troops, their impact on both the British and Amory. By early 1942, Churchill's thoughts were no longer solely focused on the logistics of war, or even on the strategic integration of American forces. His mind had shifted to a deeper, more emotional space, the space that had carried him through the long, difficult years of Britain's survival. The arrival of American troops had an immediate effect, not just on the military and strategic planning, but on the very spirit of Britain itself. As he watched the first columns of American soldiers march through the streets of London, Churchill experienced an emotional release that he had long denied himself. The men who had arrived were not just soldiers in uniforms, they were the physical embodiment of a future that seemed, until now, out of reach. Standing in the heart of London, with its buildings still scarred from the Blitz and the streets still haunted by the memories of nightly air raids, Churchill watched as the American troops marched past. It was not the grand spectacle of an official ceremony or the immediate signs of military victory. It was something far simpler, yet far more profound, the real and tangible presence of America's commitment to the war. These soldiers were not just in Britain temporarily. They had come to stay, to fight, and most importantly, to win. The contrast between the two nations, the battle-worn British and the fresh-faced Americans, was striking. The British soldiers, hardened by years of war, had lived through the horrors of the Blitz, the loss of friends, and the ever-present fear of invasion. They wore their exhaustion on their sleeves, their uniforms frayed and torn by months of combat. The Americans, by contrast, were young and confident, many of them arriving in gleaming new uniforms. Their appearance and demeanor symbolized something that Britain had not experienced for years, a fresh influx of energy, optimism, and strength. As Churchill stood in the crowd, he felt the weight of the previous 2 years lift ever so slightly. He had carried the burden of Britain's survival on his shoulders for so long, making decisions under pressure, delivering speeches, and rallying a weary nation. Now, seeing these young men march in formation, Churchill allowed himself to believe something he had been reluctant to admit: victory was possible. The war, which had seemed so uncertain, was now within reach. The presence of American soldiers on British soil was not just a shift in military tactics, it was a profound emotional shift for Churchill. In that moment, he allowed himself to believe that Britain could win this war. Someone close to Churchill, standing beside him as the American soldiers marched by, asked him what he thought of the sight. For a moment, Churchill did not respond. His eyes followed the columns of American troops, his face carefully composed. Then, as the last of the soldiers passed, Churchill's voice, thick with emotion, broke the silence. "When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war." This was not a boast. It was not a simple statement of hope. It was the first time Churchill had allowed himself to make such a definitive declaration. The weight of the years of the bombings, the sacrifices, the constant tension of knowing that Britain was standing alone had been incredibly heavy. But now, with the arrival of the Americans, Churchill saw the possibility of an Allied victory, and he spoke those words not as a political leader, but as a man who had endured the hardest years of Britain's history and who now, for the first time, could see a path forward. This simple statement encapsulated everything Churchill had fought for. It was a declaration of belief, a belief not just in the strength of the British people, but in the unity and strength of the Allied forces. For years, Churchill had worked tirelessly to forge the bond between Britain and the United States. He had courted Roosevelt with letters and meetings, all the while knowing that Britain's survival depended on America's involvement. Now, watching the American troops march past, Churchill could finally see the fruits of his labor. The emotional release that Churchill experienced that day was not just about the arrival of American troops. It was about the culmination of a years-long struggle. For 2 years, he had stood at the helm of Britain's defense against Nazi Germany, all the while knowing that Britain could not win alone. He had fought to keep the flames of hope alive, to persuade America to join the war, and to rally his own people. Now, with the arrival of the Americans, Churchill could feel the weight of those efforts finally ease. The burden of leadership, which had often felt insurmountable, was no longer solely his to bear. It was a collective effort, with the full might of the American military now in Britain's corner. In the months that followed, Churchill's optimism would only continue to grow as more American soldiers arrived. The influx of troops began to change the very fabric of Britain's war effort. As the number of American forces swelled, the logistical and tactical possibilities began to shift. No longer would Britain have to rely solely on its own exhausted forces to hold back the Axis. Now, the combined strength of British, American, and eventually other Allied forces would make victory not just a possibility, but a reality. The American forces would fight in North Africa, in Italy, in France, and finally in Germany. Churchill, who had spent so many nights worried about the outcome of the war, now saw a clear path forward. The arrival of American troops also brought with it a new sense of morale for the British people. For months, the British public had endured the horrors of war bombings, food rationing, and a constant sense of fear. But now, with the arrival of fresh forces, there was a renewed sense of hope. The Americans had come to fight to win, and the British could now see that they were no longer alone in this struggle. Churchill, as always, remained focused on the big picture. While the arrival of American troops was a huge morale boost, he knew that the real work was still ahead. The battle for Europe would be long and difficult. The Nazis were formidable foes, and the road to victory would not be easy. But Churchill also knew that the arrival of American forces had fundamentally changed the equation. No longer was the outcome uncertain. With the full might of the United States behind them, the Allies could now press their advantage. And yet, despite the optimism that Churchill felt, there were still moments of reflection, of concern. As he stood on the streets of London, watching the troops march by, he understood that these young men, with their eagerness and optimism, would soon face the brutal realities of war. Many would not return home. The cost of this war, both for the British and the Americans, would be staggering. But Churchill also understood that the resolve and spirit of these young men, their willingness to fight for a cause greater than themselves, would carry them through the darkest days of the conflict. The British people, too, would need to adjust to this new reality. As the Americans began to take their place alongside British troops, there was a natural tension that arose. The British had been fighting alone for so long that it was difficult to adjust to the presence of a new partner. The cultural differences between the two nations were also apparent. The Americans, with their youthful energy and their modern equipment, were a stark contrast to the weary British soldiers who had been in the trenches for years. But even in the midst of this tension, there was a shared sense of purpose. Both the British and the Americans knew that the fight against Nazi Germany was the fight for the future of the world. For Churchill, the arrival of American troops was a turning point in more ways than one. It was not just the beginning of a new chapter in the war, it was the moment when the balance of power began to tip in favor of the Allies. It was a moment when Churchill allowed himself to believe that victory was possible, not just a distant hope, but a certainty. The sight of those American soldiers marching through London, their uniforms crisp, their steps confident, was the moment when Churchill could finally say, without hesitation, "We are going to win this war." The arrival of American troops marked the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's domination over Europe. Churchill had fought for this moment, had hoped for it, and had worked tirelessly to make it a reality. And now, standing in the streets of London, with the sight of those soldiers marching past, he could see that the future of Britain and the world was no longer in doubt.